There's a real problem that the sheer volume and the ubiquity of illegal immigrants in the United States has, as it were, acclimatized people to talk about.
The optics of this were poor, the messaging was poor, and maybe the policy to some extent needs to be reevaluated.
Welcome to Political Perspectives. I'm Hugo Gurdon, Editor-in-Chief of The Washington Examiner. If you're joining us on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel. I'm joined today by Jim Antle, Executive Editor of The Washington Examiner magazine. And Jim, the news in the last several days has been dominated by the clash between citizens, mostly citizens, probably not all of them citizens,
right,
and federal agents in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And there's been a second death, so now 2 citizens have been shot dead by federal agents.
Right.
The death of citizens at the hands of federal agents is always a big deal, and as it obviously should be. Mm-hmm. And it seems to have produced a change of direction, some kind of a pivot from the Trump administration, hasn't it?
It absolutely has. I think, number one, the president has taken control, whereas before I think he had kind of left this in the hands of some of his deputies. And then among his deputies, now Tom Homan, the border czar, is taking a much larger hand in things rather than heads of ICE and the Border Patrol and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, who seems to be somewhat sidelined in all of this because she had taken a very aggressive public stance characterizing the second person who was fatally shot as potentially being a terrorist with intentions of taking out large numbers of law enforcement officers. We don't actually know that to be true based on any investigation yet. So the optics of this were poor, the messaging was poor, and maybe the policy to some extent needs to be reevaluated. So President Trump also spoke with the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, and the mayor of Minneapolis, both of whom have been very much out front against ICE, against immigration enforcement, and in favor of Minnesota's very liberal sanctuary policies. Right. And so that's really where things are starting to come down, is now the administration is offering to sort of ease up, but they also want local cooperation and state cooperation with immigration enforcement. And so far, they aren't getting it.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the optics. Obviously, there's no good optics when citizens are shot dead.
That's right.
But were the optics bad for other reasons? Has there been a change of heart amongst American citizens about deportation? Is there opposition not simply to fatalities, which one can really understand, but to the policy itself? And doesn't that, if there is, does that not to some extent undermine one of the cardinal policies of the Trump administration?
It does to an extent. So polling does show that pluralities do, and in some cases majorities, do continue to support the deportation of illegal immigrants. But there's always been a certain amount of ambivalence about illegal immigrants who were not involved in subsequent and particularly violent crimes once they were here after either entering illegally or overstaying their visas. The public has not always been very supportive of super harsh measures to remove such people, even if they do generally believe that even they should be removed. So there has been the question of whether the administration is prioritizing enough criminal illegal immigrants, that sounds like putting a hat on a hat, I know, but like illegal immigrants who've been involved in murders, rapes, gang activity, organized criminal activity, which certainly exists in large numbers and does represent a majority of the deportations that have taken place. But the optics of gardeners and house cleaners being deported, the public is a little bit more conflicted on that question. And then there's also the fact that many of these ICE officers are now masked when they're in public. Now they're masked because you have these activists trying to dox and harass them. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, many people are uncomfortable with masked federal agents roaming around American cities, seemingly sweeping people up. And the activists, of course, are using this to paint the picture that they want to paint, that this is sort of Trump's Gestapo, and they're just picking up, political opponents and political prisoners rather than illegal immigrants.
Yeah. We'll come back to the question of who should and who should not be deported, and what are the consequences of one thing rather than the other. But to stay just for a moment about the pivot that the administration has made, Greg Bovino, head of the Border Patrol, appears to be in trouble. Has he been punished? Is he being demoted?
He has lost this particular portfolio in the Minneapolis area and has been moved, I think, to California. He's been moved out of the state, and it does look like he is, at a minimum, regardless of what happens to his actual position, somewhat marginalized within the administration's team on this. He's no longer, I think with Corey Lewandowski and Kristi Noem and Bovino, these are the people who sort of, if there's a power struggle going on at all within the administration on this, they seem at this moment to be on the losing end.
I was going to ask you about Lewandowski and Kristi Noem. I mean, do other heads have to roll? One of the significant developments just recently is that even some Republicans on Capitol Hill have called for the firing of Kristi Noem, and I think it was Tom Tillis was saying that the events in Minnesota should be disqualifying for her as head of the Department of Homeland Security. So does it look as though more heads must roll, and will it be Lewandowski or Noem, or how do you see that playing out?
So far, the president has publicly been quite supportive of Noem, even though the optics, the 2-hour meeting that happened with her, the fact that they're not really backing her messaging on this, the fact that they've had to undertake this course correction at all certainly doesn't look good for her. The president keeps pointing to the numbers at the border, saying, well, she has been successful at that, and that's an important part of what her job is. I think President Trump, having now put in a bunch of loyalists in his cabinet and in other senior positions, is also trying in the second term to make loyalty a bit more of a two-way street. So I think he's reluctant to remove her to satisfy people who are either political opponents or what he would regard as sort of softer or weaker Republicans. He mentions that Tom Tillis has decided not to run for re-election, and Lisa Murkowski, he says, well, she's always against us anyway. But that doesn't necessarily mean she's safe forever, because I think we do see, even if the president isn't ready to disavow her or fire her, he has clearly recognized that her handling of this situation has been suboptimal and is trying to make a change.
Well, and firing her now would perhaps send a signal that he was embarrassed about his administration's work in a way that he would not want to do, but perhaps there's a longer off-ramp for her that she might find herself not in that job.
Yes, I think the dilemma is that anytime you fire her, if you do that, you're going to have to appoint somebody to replace her. And the Senate confirmation hearings for that will relitigate all of these issues again anyway. So you have to be pretty sure you have somebody either in the interim or over the longer term who could replace her, who could get confirmed, and who could weather these hearings successfully. If you wait too long, and potentially you wait after the midterms, do you still have control of the Senate? Republicans are still more favored to hold the Senate than they are the House. But if things get bad enough, it's not out of the question they could lose the Senate, at which point it becomes very difficult to confirm the type of person that President Trump would like leading that department.
Well, that brings me to Tom Homan, who has been sent out to Minnesota. He's now taken charge, I believe, of the law enforcement, federal law enforcement, that is, up there. Is that a change in policy? Is that just putting someone in who has a safer pair of hands? How do you read that?
Well, Tom Homan is said to be in favor of prioritizing the deportation of criminal aliens. So not necessarily just trying to gin up the biggest numbers possible in terms of deportations. Although he is, in general, a very strong supporter of the president's deportation agenda, he is also, both in this term and in the first term, been in favor of doing some fairly tough things that would really more for a deterrent effect on future illegal immigration. So he's been willing to do some fairly harsh things, but he also has a history in the Obama administration. Former President Obama undertook a large number of deportations. Some of them were border apprehensions, sort of reclassified as deportations, but nevertheless he wanted to appear very strong on deportations. In his case, largely to build credibility for amnesty or comprehensive immigration reform, but nevertheless they're trying to remove and show some credibility on enforcement. So Homan has a long history dealing with this issue and is viewed as a serious lawman, although he is still a tough guy and he is still somebody very willing in public and in occasionally hostile areas to defend the president's policies.
So what's been happening in Minnesota is now playing into the question of whether or not the government shuts down again, because we have that deadline looming. Democrats want part of that question to be resolved about shutdown to include who should be deported. And they want only those who for whom warrants have been issued, which involves court proceedings or involves a judge. And it would, as a matter of fact, even if perhaps not in theory, mean that only those who had committed crimes after entering the country illegally would be deported. It would be extremely time-consuming. It would drastically limit the deportation of illegal immigrants. And so would Republicans, would Trump, would the president possibly concede that and go along with that? And how much leverage does the Democrats have to make that the case?
Well, I think the problem with that is that they effectively oppose most deportations. They're maybe not going as far as the most radical fringe of the party wants to go and essentially say deportations are racist and illegitimate, other than maybe in a case where you're using it like a tax violation against Al Capone. And in fact, some Democratic senators have used as poster children for the wrongness and immorality of the Trump deportation agenda people who actually have criminal convictions or fairly serious criminal allegations against them, and going to have court hearings on crimes that are not really related to their immigration status. So their credibility on this issue is a bit questionable. But I don't think the president is likely to concede and can easily and readily concede that most illegal immigrants in the country should not be deported. He might be willing to have tiers in terms of priorities, which I think most people think is reasonable. And he might be willing to use a bit more discretion than maybe has been used in the recent past. In terms of the Democrats' leverage, they run into the same problem they run into eventually with the first shutdown, although this would not be a full shutdown, it would be a partial shutdown, in that there are eventually services that are widely used by taxpayers that will be adversely impacted by a shutdown. And can you keep these government services interrupted forever for policy goals that, depending on how they're messaged, may or may not really be that popular? In the first term, there were 2 shutdowns related to immigration fights. Trump won the first one pretty easily because red state Democratic senators running for re-election that year did not want to shut the government down over amnesty. Over border wall funding, though, toward the end of 2018 and the beginning of 2019, that ended up being much more of a loss. So Democrats, I think, maybe feel a little bit emboldened, but there will come a point where things like snow removal become a bigger priority to voters than ICE.
So Jim, the final question that I want to ask on this is really about, although most people would accept that there needs to be some deportations which are higher priority than others. You want to get rid of the murderers, the violent criminals, the thieves, etc., and it's less important to get rid of and to deport those who've simply come into the country improperly and illegally and then become productive members of the society. Nevertheless, there are a lot of people who would say that if you say millions of people who have arrived here, who had no right to be here and broke the law to come here, if you say that they are allowed to stay, then you create the moral hazard that you depict the United States, you present the United States to the rest of the world, no longer as the beacon of the nation of laws rather than of men that it has been nearly for 250 years, and you say it is no longer interested in and will not take action to enforce its own laws. And that's a very bad message, it seems to me. And it also suggests that as soon as there is a president in the White House, a Democrat, who does not believe in strong immigration laws and the protection of the border, you invite more millions of people to come here who should not be here. This is a big, sort of almost philosophical as well as a practical matter, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the Biden border surge really began before former President Biden started relaxing various first-term Trump administration immigration policies. The relaxation of those policies and the abandonment of those policies was important to why illegal immigration got so out of control under the Biden administration. But the simple fact that Biden became president and people believed that if they entered the country illegally, they would be very unlikely to be made to go home, particularly once they made it across the border and made it into the interior of the United States.
Right.
You know, that there might be some likelihood if they stayed really close to the border that they'd be turned away. But once they made it into the country, they were likely home free. And that really incentivized a great deal of illegal immigration. And similarly, before Trump stepped up enforcement again and reinstated some of his own old policies and pursued some new ones, the simple fact that Donald Trump became president again sent a message to would-be illegal immigrants that started border crossings on a downward trajectory even before this crackdown really began in earnest. So telling large numbers of people that they can probably get away with being illegal immigrants in the United States only encourages more illegal immigration. Also, the sheer volume of illegal immigration, when you have 10 to 20 million people coming in, it means that there probably will be some criminals that you don't know about. There are just a large number and an unmanageable number of people who you don't really know that much about. You haven't really vetted them in any serious way. They weren't really invited here. So the numbers themselves become a problem at a certain point.
Yeah, and I've been writing about that, and this is where we'll close. There's a real problem that the sheer volume and the ubiquity of illegal immigrants in the United States has, as it were, acclimatized people to talk about illegal immigrants as though they were just now a constant and irreducible fact of national life, and which in itself makes it harder for a government which wants to enforce those laws, and indeed the public wants those laws enforced. It doesn't want just they believe, as President Trump said, that if you don't have a border, you don't have a nation. They believe that they have the right, and it seems to me an absolute moral imperative, that the citizens of a country, the citizens of a democracy, must be the people who choose who may come and live in their country as their neighbors and who may not. And that means there must be laws, and those laws, it is the constitutional responsibility of the administration to enforce. Jim, thanks very much for coming and talking about this today.
Thank you.
We'll be back next week with Political Perspectives. Thank you all for joining us. And as mentioned before, if you've joined us on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel.